Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to this cramped room. This is a Sunday. This is the second day of our Bengal History Week. We have a 10-day program. It's going to be quite hectic, especially for us who are organizing it. I'm sure it will be really nice and rewarding for us and people who come. I'm just going to say a little bit about Bengal History Week, why we started and the purpose, and then I will pass on to the speaker and her guests. Some people might have heard this, so they might be bored. In 2007 was 250 years of the Battle of Plassey, when the British took over Bengal. And I grew up in this country not really knowing our history properly, just knew bits and pieces. But there's a lot of shared memory, about Battle of Plassey, about Whitechapel, about Robert Clark and Sharmeen and so on. But this is, like we just heard from people. We didn't get a chance to really look at the data, facts, archives, and sources of information to sort of understand for ourselves. So we organized some activities around in 2007, just to commemorate, just to try and learn and understand what happened and the impact and the consequences and so on. And then also, you get new ideas coming to your head, and we had this idea of getting some young people engaged with the project so that they will research and they will learn about East India Company. So 8 young people wrote this book. They were 18 to 25. It's called Plassey's Legacy, right? And when this just finished, one of the girls said, we learned so much. Why don't we have an annual Bengal History Week so that we can continue this learning process? So we thought, they worked so hard, so we might as well do something for them, right? So that's how this started. So this is the 6th annual Bengal History Week. What we try to do, especially in the Bangladeshi community, I don't know about other communities, we have really polarized understanding of history, or polarized views of history. One group interprets history one way, another group interprets another way. And there's no sort of meeting point, no sort of exploring, no empathy, no trying to understand and explore, critically engage with each other so that we can get more nearer the truth. So we don't pick subjects that we want to cover this subject or that subject this year, and next year we're going to cover another subject. We're looking for people who are doing research, who are research, who are scholars, and then when you find them, and they choose the subject. So we are really interested in exploring as many topics as possible, right? And so when we find speakers or when people come forward, say they're interested in speaking, so we always welcome them because we want to cover as many topics as possible. I'm not going to talk anymore. So, and many of you heard about Madhusudan Dutt. We grew up hearing. So I will pass on to you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Hello everyone, I'm Sharmeen, and as you know, I'm going to be talking to you today about Michael Madhusudan Dutt. Now, some of you will know that he is a very well-known and famous 19th century Bengali poet and playwright. But before I talk to you about Dutt, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and how I came to be interested in 19th century Bengali literature. I'm ethnically Bengali. I'm from Bangladesh, from a town called Whitechapel, and I was born and grew up in London. So what this means is that although I've always spoken Bengali, it's only been in the last 3 or 4 years that I've really learnt to read Bengali with any degree of fluency, and that's due to the language classes and a master's degree that I've just completed at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Now, the first area of my academic interest was actually English literature, not Bengali literature. That was what my first degree was in. So I have this dual interest in English literature and in Bengali literature. And I like to think that in some ways that gives me some similarities to the 19th century Bengali writers. Because if you think about it, in the 19th century, Bengal, as some of you will know, was part of India, and India was governed by the British. And the seat of British government in India was Calcutta. And what that meant was that they grew up in Calcutta, a small Bengali-speaking class that also spoke English and was educated in English. This class worked with the British in the lower and middle ranks of the Indian civil service. And this class was called the Bhadralok. Now, Manga Pusher was part of this class. He was part of the Bhadralok class, and he spent a large part of his life in Calcutta. Now, the Bhadralok was quite a small class, but it was responsible for a significant proportion, though by no means all, of the literature that was written in Bengal in the 19th century. And the Bhadralok had two major influences on them. They had their own literature, their own literary tradition, Bengali literature, influenced also by Sanskrit and Persian. But they were also influenced by Western culture through their work, through their education. So they're influenced both by Bengali literature and English literature. And so I like to think this dual interest that I have in Bengali and English literature gives me a tiny connection with these writers of the 19th century. Now, to go back to the subject of my talk now, Madhusudan Dutt, I'm going to spend a good 10 minutes talking to you about his life for a number of reasons. One is that he actually had a very interesting life. The second is that I think it's only by knowing about his life that you get a context for his work, particularly the comedies that I'm going to talk to you about. And the last reason is because I think a lot of the issues that he faced in his life, a lot of the issues he wrote about, they still have a contemporary significance for us today in the 21st century. If I show you a picture of Manga Pusher now, you'll see from these pictures that he's a very European-looking Indian. I mean, this is a Bengali man from the 19th century. He's wearing European clothes. He has very European facial hair. Those are Victorian mutton chop whiskers that he has. And he's actually been called the first fully westernised Bengali poet to compose works in the Bengali language. And yet, Manga Pusher actually had a very traditional childhood. He was born in Joshua in 1824 in a village called Shagodari. Many of you will know that Joshua is was in East Bengal then and is now part of Bangladesh. And the house that he was born in actually still exists. If you happen to be in Joshua, you can see it. It's a museum now. As I say, if you are in Joshua, do go and see it. Now, Manga Pusher was born in a Kayastha caste family, so a higher caste family. And his father, Sharmeen Haque, was actually a very interesting man. He was a very smart man. He was the first Dutt to actually make a significant amount of money in the family. And he did this as a lawyer. And he was also fluent in Persian. And this was important at the time because if you think about it, before the British governed India, large parts of India were governed by the Mughals. And just as under the British, you needed English to succeed professionally, so under the Mughals, you needed Persian because that was their language of administration. So Sharmeen Haque, Michael Dutt's father, was fluent in Persian and he was a lawyer, and that was how he made his money. Now, he made sure that his young son had a traditional Bengali education for the first 10 years of his life. He sent him off to the local village school, the local Bengali Pathshala, and he learnt Bengali there. He also made sure that his son learnt Persian. He sent him off to a school in the next village to learn Persian. And at this time, Manga Pusher Dutt's mother, Janavi Dutt, was also an important influence on him. She was very unusual for a woman of the 19th century, early 19th century in Bengal, in that she could read and write Bengali fluently. Now, in those days, literacy, certainly in the early 19th century, for Bengali women really wasn't encouraged. In those days, there was a belief that a literate woman would become a widow. So, as you can see, literary wasn't something to be encouraged. But nevertheless, Janavi Devi, Manga Pusher Dutt's mother, could read and write Bengali fluently, and she read to her son. And what she read to him were medieval Bengali stories, and these stories were based on the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which were Sanskrit epics. So you see that in the first 10 years of his life, he has this very traditional Bengali childhood. He learns to read and write Bengali. He's read Bengali literature. He's influenced by Sanskrit mythology, and he learns some Persian. Now, this all changed when he was 10, at which point the family moved to Calcutta. By then, Sharmeen Dutt had made enough money to build a big house in Calcutta, and he moved his wife and his son there. And as I've said, Sharmeen Dutt was a very smart man, and he realised that although Persian had been very important to him in the changing political climate of the 19th century in India, English was going to become much more important because the British were becoming much more predominant. So just as he'd needed Persian to succeed professionally, his son was going to need English to succeed professionally. So he enrolled his son in the preeminent English medium school of the time, which was called the Hindu College. And the Hindu College had actually been set up by a group of Bhadralok, these Bengali but English-speaking people who worked with the British. They set up an English medium school called the Hindu College in the early 19th century. Because they wanted their sons to have a good English education in the English medium so they could progress professionally. And Madhusudan Dutt started at this school, and this is where he becomes very westernised. It's at this point he starts to wear European clothing. He's exposed to English literature, to Shakespeare, to Milton, to Byron, to Keats, to Shelley, and it's actually at this point that he starts to write, but he doesn't write in Bengali, he writes in English. He writes English poems, and a lot of those poems about how he desperately wants to go to England, and he actually sends these poems off to literary magazines in England to try and get them published. So you see now these two sets of influences on Madhusudan, the traditional Bengali influences of his childhood and the Western influences of his adolescence. Now, Madhusudan's now 18, and there's a whole new set of that come into his life now. At this stage, at the age of 18, his father arranges a marriage for him, and this is quite common at that time. Fathers often arranged marriages for their sons when their sons were in their late teens, to girls who were usually 12 or younger. And many of Michael Madhusudan Dutt's contemporaries, his friends at the Hindu College, had these sort of marriages. But Michael Madhusudan Dutt didn't want an arranged marriage. He was prepared to defy his father over this. And I think, you know, a lot of us are from a South Asian background, and even now it's quite unusual to defy our parents. So you can imagine how much more unusual this was over 150 years ago. But Madhusudan Dutt at this time, he doesn't want this arranged marriage, but he's only 18, so he doesn't have the financial means to defy his father, but he's determined he's not going to have this marriage. So he comes up with a plan to defy his father, and he decides what he's going to do is he's going to convert to Christianity. Now that's certainly going to stop the marriage, because no high caste Hindu girl is going to want to marry a Christian convert, but he also has another motive. Now, this is the 1840s now in British India, in Calcutta, and around this time the British missionary movement became quite active in Calcutta and began to try to convert Indians. And a lot of the British missionaries at this point were accused of creating what was called rice Christians. The accusation was that British missionaries went to poorer Indians, they gave them gifts of food and other material benefits, and so they essentially bribed them into Christianity, and those Christians were called rice Christians. There were very few at this stage well-educated, high-caste Hindu converts to Christianity. And Michael Madhusudan Dutt was aware of this, and he hoped that by becoming a Christian, he'd be welcomed by the Christian community, and he would perhaps then be able to go to England. So that was another motive in his conversion to Christianity. So he converts at the age of 18, and this has a series of consequences. It does stop the marriage, but he isn't at this stage able to go to England. Something that he hadn't foreseen was that he was going to have to leave the Hindu college, because, as the name suggests, this was a college just for Hindus. So he was thrown out of there, and he had to go to a missionary college instead in Calcutta. And of course he became estranged from his family, and his father eventually stopped supporting him financially, and this meant that Michael Madhusudan Dutt couldn't complete his college education now. He needed to earn a living. And he decided that he was going to earn a living, but he was going to go to Madras, which was hundreds of miles away, of course, in South India. So we've seen now three sets of influences on Dutt's life, the traditional Bengali influences, then the influence of Western education, a whole set of influences from his conversion to Christianity, and now he goes to Madras, a city hundreds of miles away, where he earns his living as a teacher and a journalist. And here he is subject to another whole set of influences. He teaches first an orphanage school for European and Anglo-Indian or mixed race children. And while he's teaching at this school, this exposes him to a much wider class than he was probably used to in Calcutta, because Anglo-Indian children at this time were often the offspring of marriages between poorer British men and less well-off Indian women. And you can see this from the fact that in the school that Madhusudan Dutt taught at, the boys, as well as being taught academically, were also taught trades. They were taught shoemaking, they were taught carpentry. The girls, as well as being taught to read and write, were also taught to sew. So he comes into contact, much closer contact, with a wider class of people than he was probably familiar with in Calcutta. And whilst he's in Madras, he continues to write, but he's still writing in English. He writes poems, he writes plays, and they're all still in English. Now, while he's in Madras, he also falls in love with one of his pupils. She's called Rebecca, and she's the daughter of an English gunner, so an ordinary English soldier, not an officer or a colonel, and her mother's an Anglo-Indian woman. So he marries Rebecca, and they have 4 children in quick succession. But at this point his love life actually becomes very complicated, because he also falls in love with another woman who is the daughter of a colleague of his. His colleague is a British teacher, and his daughter is called Henrietta. So it appears that during his marriage to Rebecca, he's also having an affair with Henrietta. So then in the 1850s, he receives the news that his father has died, his mother's already died, and he decides that he's going to go back to Calcutta to sort out his family estates. And that's what he does. So now Madhusudan Dutt is back in Calcutta, and for reasons, and we don't know the reasons for this, he never returns to Madras. He never sees his wife again, he never sees Rebecca again, he never sees his 4 children again. It's probable that Rebecca found out about his affair with Henrietta at this stage, so there was some sort of breakup there. What does happen, though, is that Henrietta, his mistress, follows him to Calcutta, and she lives with him for the rest of his life as his wife, though actually, as he's never actually divorced Rebecca, she isn't in fact his wife, but she lives with him for the rest of his life as his wife. Henrietta rather, and Madhusudan Dutt go on to have 3 children. Now, it's while he's in Calcutta that he actually writes the majority of the works in Bengali that he's so famous for, and he writes them in a very short period of time. He writes them between 1859 and 1862, which is just 3-4 years, really. It's at this time that he writes the long blank verse poem that he's most well known for, and that some of you are probably familiar with, Meghnad Badh Kabya, which is based on an episode from the Ramayana, the Sanskrit epic. He also at this time writes 3 other long narrative poems, and he writes 5 plays as well, so that's a huge amount of writing in 4 or 5 years. And he also writes several short poems. So it's a hugely creative period for him, and it's the period that the works that he is most well known for are written in. Now, as I said to you at the beginning, I've spent a fair amount of time talking to you about Michael Madhusudan Dutt's life, and I want to reiterate to you all again the different influences on him in his life. He has this very traditional Bengali childhood. He's then exposed to Western culture at the Hindu college. He then converts, so there's a whole set of Christian influences. And then he goes to Madras, where he works as a journalist and a teacher, and he's exposed to a much wider class of people in Madras than he was in Calcutta. And I think all these different influences in his life are really important because they really give you a context for his work, particularly the comedies, the social farces that he wrote. I said to you he wrote 5 plays, and 2 of them were farces, and it's those comedies that I'm going to talk about today. The comedy that I'm going to talk about the most is called Eke ki bole Shabhatha, or Is This What You Call Civilization? Now, as I've said to you, Dutt was very influenced by European culture. He wore European clothes. He wrote at the beginning in English. Throughout his life, he wrote letters to his friends in English. And as I've said, he had 2 European wives. But he was by no means somebody who slavishly followed European culture. And I think you see this very much in this play, Is This What You Call Civilization? Now, I need to talk a little bit about the history of Calcutta again to give you the context for the play. As I've said to you, Calcutta was the seat of British administration in India. And that meant there grew up in Calcutta a Bengali class that was English speaking and sometimes English educated that worked with the English, and they were, as I said to you, called the Bhadralok. And as I've also said, the Bhadralok set up a college called the Hindu College for their sons, so their sons could be educated in English, in the English medium, and they could progress professionally. But some of their sons probably became a bit more anglicised than their fathers would have wanted them to, and they grew up a movement in the late 1830s called Young Bengal. Now, Young Bengal consisted mainly of young men. They were English educated. They were often Hindu college students. And they defined themselves by, in opposition to religious orthodoxies. So they were against caste restrictions. They were against religious prohibitions on food, for example. So they would eat beef, they would drink alcohol. They celebrated Western culture, particularly English literature. They were great advocates of social reform. As I said, they were against caste restrictions. They were also very much in favour of women's rights. They promoted women's education. They were against child marriage. And they were in favour of widow remarriage, which was forbidden to Hindu widows for a large part of the 19th century. And these men also followed European habits in dress and food. So essentially, Young Bengal was a group which saw itself as challenging the superstitions and restrictions in their own culture under the influence of European culture. What actually happened, though, to some extent, was that the ideals of Young Bengal degenerated and were corrupted, and many societies were set up like Young Bengal, and what actually happened in these societies was that the supposed challenge to religious restrictions and oppressions actually just became an excuse for getting very drunk, and an interest in social reform and women's emancipation tended to translates itself into an excuse for entertaining prostitutes. And you see the degeneration of ideals very much in this play, Is This What You Call Civilization? In this play, Dutt writes about a society which is set up by a group of young Bengali men who are English educated, and the basis of this society is supposed to be a challenge to religious restrictions and advocation of female emancipation. But actually, you see from this, the reading that we're going to have in a minute, is that the society is actually just really an excuse for drinking and whoring. So I'm going to ask Priyanka now to read the scene in Bengali, and I'm then going to read it to you in English, and then Priyanka's going to do a dance, which is also part of the play. So, Priyanka.
Nobo. Gentlemen, এই সভার নাম জ্ঞানতরঙ্গিনী সভা। আমরা সকলে এর মেম্বার। আমরা এখানে মিট করি যাতে জ্ঞান জন্মে তাই করে থাকি, and we are jolly good fellows. সকলে, here here, we are jolly good fellows. নব, gentlemen, আমাদের সকলের হিন্দুকুলে জন্ম, কিন্তু আমরা বিদ্যা বলে সুপারস্টিশনের শিকলি কেটে ফ্রি হয়েছি। আমরা পুত্তলিকা দেখে হাঁটু নোয়াতে আর স্বীকার করি না। জ্ঞানের বাতির দ্বারা আমাদের অজ্ঞান অন্ধকার দূর হয়েছে। এখন আমার প্রার্থনা এই যে সোশ্যাল রিফর্মেশন যাতে হয় তার চেষ্টা করা। সকলে, হিয়ার হিয়ার। নব, জেন্টলম্যান, তোমাদের মেয়েদের এডুকেট করো, তাদের স্বাধীনতা দাও, জাতভেদ তফাৎ করো, বিধবাদের বিবাহ দাও। তাহলে এবং কেবল তাহলেই আমাদের প্রিয় ভারতভূমি ইংল্যান্ড প্রভৃতি সভ্য দেশের সঙ্গে টক্কর দিতে পারবে, নচেত নয়। সকলে হিয়ার হিয়ার। নব: কিন্তু জেন্টলম্যান, এখন এদেশ আমাদের পক্ষে যেন এক মস্ত জেলখানা। এই গৃহ কেবল আমাদের লিবার্টি হল, অর্থাৎ আমাদের স্বাধীনতার দালান। এখানে যার যে খুশি সে তাই করো। Gentlemen, in the name of freedom, let us enjoy ourselves. উপবেশন। সকলে হিয়ার হিয়ার, হিপ হিপ হুররে। লিবার্টি হল, বি ফ্রি, let us enjoy ourselves. নব: ওহে বলাই, এবার সকলকে দাও না। বলাই: আচ্ছা এই এসো, সকলের মদ্যপান। নব: তবে এবার নাচ আরম্ভ হোক। কাম, ওপেন দি বল মাই বিউটিস। পয়োধরী এবং নিতম্বনী, নৃত্য এবং গীত।
So I'm going to read that. Thank you very much, Priyanka. That was to save you my very English accented Bengali. I'm going to read it to you in English now. The person who's speaking is Nobo, who's the young man who set up this society. Gentlemen, this society's name is the Gayan Tarangini Society. We are all members of it. We meet here in order to ensure that we acquire knowledge, and we are all jolly good fellows. Hear, hear, we are jolly good fellows. Gentlemen, we were all born into the Hindu religion, but the force of our learning has cut us free from the chains of superstition. We no longer acquiesce to bowing before idols. The darkness of our ignorance has receded by the means of our lamp of knowledge. Now this is my prayer, that you are all of one mind and heart, and that you try to bring about the social reformation of this country. Hear, hear! Gentlemen, educate your daughters, give them independence, remove the separation between castes, and allow the remarriage of widows. When that happens, and only when that happens, can our beloved land of India compete with England and similar civilized nations. Otherwise, it cannot. Hear, hear! But gentlemen, now this country is like a giant prison for our followers. Only this dwelling is our Liberty Hall, that is to say, the hall of our freedom. Here, anyone can do whatever they want. Gentlemen, in the name of freedom, let us enjoy ourselves. Hear, hear, hip hip hooray, Liberty Hall, be free, let us enjoy ourselves. Come on, ballet, pour everyone a drink, won't you? Now then, let the dancing start. Bring on the girls and open the ball. At which point there's a dance which Priyanka, this would be in the play, so Priyanka's going to do this dance for you. Thank you, Priyanka. So as you see, all that highfalutin talk about emancipation and women's rights and opposing religious restrictions actually ends up in a very suggestive dance by a prostitute. And that's which. Thank you, Priyanka. Has she taken her bags? Her suitcase? Come on, suitcase, and you get your Priyanka? Suitcase, that's your. Thank you. Priyanka's going off. She's not offended. She's just going off. She's going off to a dance practice that she has. It's Durga Puja next week, so she's very busy. Now, that's a very funny scene, I think. But it also has a serious point, which I think has contemporary relevance. I think one of the things that Datta is looking at in that scene is the predicament people are or people face when they're living in two cultures. When you're living in two cultures, what do you retain from your own culture and what do you take, what do you assimilate from the other culture? And I think that's something that resonates with many of us, but it certainly resonates with me as a South Asian living in a European country. And I think what Datta's saying there is that there's no problem with taking things from another culture. Of course there isn't. But you do have to be careful what you take. It's all very well questioning the unfair religious restrictions and superstitions in your own culture. But don't let that then be an excuse for debauchery and drunkenness. And I think that's put very well actually at the end of his play, when one of the wives of one of these men who set up this society says, "The wretches even claim that we have become as civilized as the sahibs. Does it make a man civilized? Drinking alcohol, eating meat and having affairs? Is that what you call civilization?" Which is where the play takes its name from. Now, as I said, that scene ends in a prostitute's dance. And prostitution was actually a huge social issue in 19th century Calcutta. In the late 1860s in Calcutta, shortly after the play was written, Calcutta had a population of 400,000. Now, official figures show that of that, 30,000 women were prostitutes. Now, if you think of the 400,000, say half were women, so 200,000 were women, that means a staggering 15% of women in Calcutta were prostitutes. Over 1 in 10 women in Calcutta in the late 1860s was engaged in prostitution. Now, the 19th century Bhadralok, one of the issues that they were very interested in was the rights of women. So they promoted female education, they campaigned against child marriage, and they tried to encourage Hindu widows to remarry, which had been forbidden for much of the 19th century. And one of the great reformers of 19th century Bengal was Ishwar Chandra Vidyashagar. But many of these reformers, although they were very interested in the rights of women, they weren't really interested in the rights of women who were prostitutes. And I think you see this very much in Vidyashagar. Now, Vidyashagar did a huge amount for women in the 19th century. He promoted female education, and he was the driving force behind the campaign that led to legislation which allowed Hindu widows to remarry. Now, Vidyashogar, as well as being this great social reformer, was also very interested in theatre. And in the 1870s in Calcutta, for the first time, female actresses came onto the Calcutta stage. Up to then, men had taken the parts of women, rather as had happened in Elizabethan theatre in this country. And the women who became actresses were prostitutes, because middle-class women didn't want to be on the public stage in those days. Now, Vidyashogar, who was this great reformer, hugely interested in the rights of women, and was also very interested in theatre, once prostitutes became actresses, he disapproved of this, and he just stopped going to the theatre. So this is a man who's hugely interested in women's rights, but wasn't very interested, I think, in the rights of women who are prostitutes. And the Bhadralok writers generally are silent about these sorts of women. If we consider Tagore, and of course Rabindranath Tagore is the preeminent Bengali writer of the 19th century, he wrote very sympathetically about women. He wrote several novels in which he represents the plight of 19th century women very sympathetically. He wrote about the hardships of young widows who couldn't get remarried in Chokabali. He wrote about the difficulties of child brides adjusting to their much older husbands in Noshtanir. And he wrote about the complexities of women coming out of purdah and seclusion in Korebaire. But he's completely silent on the subject of prostitution. Now, Michael Madhusudan Dutt does give voice to these women. There are two earlier scenes in this play when prostitutes are represented on stage, and they're presented as women who are earning a living. There's no moral judgment, there's no disapproval. And I think it's a real characteristic of Dutt in his farces that he gives voice to those people who were rarely given a voice in Bhadralok literature. You also see this in his other farce. His other farce is called New Feathers on an Old Bird, or Burushalikar Kare Ron. And a central figure in that farce is a Muslim cultivator or a peasant called Hanif Ghazi. And it was very rare in Bhadralok literature that a Muslim peasant was given centre stage. And I think Michael Madhusudan Dutt is really unique among Bhadralok writers in that he gives voice to those who weren't generally represented in 19th century literature, whether they're prostitutes or whether they're peasants. Now, I've said that I think Michael Madhusudan Dutt has a very contemporary relevance, and I think one of the ways he has this contemporary relevance is in his attitude to the Bengali language and the English language. Though Madhusudan Dutt was born in Bengal, I think it's fair to say, and I hope you'll agree with me from what you've heard today, that his first love was the English language. He went, as we saw, to this English medium school, the Hindu college. He was very influenced by English culture. His first poems and plays that he wrote were in the English language. He was writing English poems in Calcutta during his adolescence. He was writing English poems and plays in Madras when he was in his 20s. It wasn't until he returned to Calcutta in his 30s that he wrote the great works that he has become famous for in the Bengali language, and he came to understand the beauty of the Bengali language. And really, the predicament that Dutt faced with his allegiance to English, his allegiance to Bengali, really resonates with me and I think some of my contemporaries who've spent all or most of our lives in England. It's very easy for us to love English literature and to love English language. It's a beautiful language, it's a beautiful literature. I did my first degree in it, and it's also all around us. But it's very easy for us to forget the beauty of the Bengali language. For many of us, that's much harder to access. We don't know it as well as we know English. It's difficult to find it in translation. A lot of Bengali works haven't been translated. And that's the predicament that Dutt also expresses in a very famous poem of his called Manga Pusher, which is about how he seeks for linguistic beauties in other languages, forgetting that he has all these beauties in his own language. And what I'm going to do, if Rose will come and sit next to me, is I'm first going to read you part of that poem in Bengali, and Rose is then going to read you the whole of that sonnet in, sorry, I'm going to read it to you in English, and Rose is going to read it to you in Bengali. The poem, which is called Manga Pusher, or the Bengali language. There were countless jewels beyond price in my own storeroom. Neglecting them all, I wandered from country to country in greed for wealth, like a merchant ship from port to port. In a dream one night, the goddess of the race of Bengal said to me, "Child, the goddess Saraswati, seeing your devotion, looks kindly on you. You have wealth at home, so why have you turned yourself into a beggar, rich as you are? Why are you joyless today in a mansion of joy?" And I'm going to ask Rose to read it for me now in Bengali. Thank you.
হে বঙ্গ ভাণ্ডারে অব বিবিধ রতন, তা সবে অবোধ আমি অবহেলা করি, পরধন লোভে মত্ত করিনি ভ্রমণ পরদেশে, ভিক্ষাপ্রীতি কুক্ষণে আচরি, কাটাইনি বহুদিন সুখ হরি হরি, অনিদ্রায় নিরাহারে সপি খায় মন, মজিন বিফল তবে অবরণ নিজ, কেলিয়ে শৈবালে ভুলি কমল কনক, স্বপ্নে তব কুললক্ষ্মী কয়ে দিলা পরে, পরে বাছা মাতৃকোষে রতনের রাজি, এ ভিখারি দশা তবে কেন তোর আজি? যা ফিরি অজ্ঞান তুই, যারে ফিরি ঘরে, পাইলাম আজ্ঞা সুখে, পাইলাম কালে, মাতৃভাষার রূপক্ষণে পূর্ণ মনে যাবে।
Thank you. I'm going to come to my conclusion now, and I hope that in giving this talk to you, I've been able to share with you first what an unusual man Michael Madhusudan Dutt was, and what an interesting life he had. If any of you are interested, he did actually get to England eventually, because after he wrote all these poems and plays, he decided he wasn't going to be a poet anymore. He wanted to be a barrister. So he went to England, he sold up all his lands in Calcutta, went to England, trained as a barrister, came back to Calcutta and practiced, though not actually very successfully. And he actually died relatively young and in poverty at the age of 49. So as I say, he's a very interesting man. He had a very unusual life. But I think also the issues and the conflicts that Michael Madhusudan Dutt faced in his life, his falling between and embracing two cultures, and deciding what to take from them and what not, the way that he came to realise the value of his own language. These, I think, are issues that we all face as South Asians in 21st century Britain. So as I say, I think he is a figure who has a huge contemporary relevance. Thank you. So if anybody has any questions, I'm not an expert in Datta by any means, but I'm certainly happy to try and answer any questions.
If no one's going to ask,
Yes, please do.
Do you have any brothers and sisters or influence of aunts or extended family?
He did have two younger brothers, but they both died when he was very young. I think they both died before he moved to Calcutta. In fact, I think that may have been one of the reasons they moved to Calcutta. So He did have uncles, but I don't think they were hugely influential. From what I've read, I don't think they were hugely influential on his life. The really big influences on his life were his father. He was actually very close to his father before this, and he was very proud of his father before this break with him converting to Christianity. So he had a huge amount of attention from both his mother and his father because he was effectively an only son.
No, it's very interesting because I'd heard of Michael Madhusudan Dutt because I was educated in India, and I was educated in an English medium school. We never studied Bengali. We were encouraged to speak in English at home, in England, in school, and so it was my mum who taught us Bengali at home. We read books, but all I'd known of Michael Madhusudan Dutt was how he was so enamored of the Western education that he changed his name. I didn't realize that he had actually converted to Christianity. It's very interesting to find out the reason why he's called Michael Madhusudan Dutt.
Well, actually, it's interesting about the conversion and his name because he didn't actually need to take the English name because there were a lot of converts to Christianity, Indian converts to Christianity, who didn't change their names. And Michael Madhusudan Dutt did change his name at some point after conversion, and it's not quite clear why, because it wasn't a requirement of conversion, but he did change his name, though of course he was born as Madhusudan Dutt. But yeah, I mean, I think the point about even in India today, I know I've spoken to South Indian girls at conferences, young girls in their 20s, and I've said to them, oh, you know, what Indian language do you speak at home? And they'll say, oh, we speak English at home. So it's an issue, I think, not just for Bengalis and Indians and South Asians in European countries. It's an issue, I think, also for some of us, Indians at home as well.
I have a Sri Lankan friend, and she never spoke Sinhala at home because she spoke in English to her parents, and Sinhala was used to speak to the servants. And another point I'd like to make is about the issue of the prostitutes in literature. Amongst the books that I have read, there was Sarat Chandra Chatterjee, also a very eminent Bengali author of that time, and he certainly wrote very sympathetically about prostitutes.
Okay, well, thank you.
And the dancers and such like that.
Okay, thank you.
Employed.
Thank you. Well, that's something I've learned today then. So thank you.
Probably not to Islam, so I think he mentioned something about.
Does he? Yeah. I'm not saying that people don't like them about them at all, but it's unusual, I think, in literature of that time. But it is interesting to know, and I will go and look. I'm not actually very familiar with Sharat Chandra's works. It's something that I need to read, and I will do. Exactly. Devdas, of course, yes, because it's the woman that he goes off with before the, of course, yeah.
Any other questions? You usually ask questions.
Well, obviously I've said everything that needs to be said about Michael Madhusudan Dutt. Nobody has anything else to ask about him. Hannah, go on.
I just wanted to add one thing that didn't become entirely clear, but his decision to change from writing in English to writing in Bengali. Do you want to say something more about that?
Yeah, what actually happened, I didn't go into it in great detail, but I was hoping somebody would ask this kind of a question so I could go into it in the questions. What happened was he went back to Calcutta and he was actually working as an interpreter, I think, at the court. But somebody had written a play which was actually a Bengali translation of a Sanskrit work. And this Bengali play was called Ratnavali. And it was going to be presented in a particular sort of private theatre. And there were going to be British officials present in this presentation of the play. And of course, they wouldn't understand it because it was in Bengali. And so they needed someone to translate the play. They needed someone to translate Ratnavali, and they asked Michael Madhusudan Dutt to do this because everybody knew he was very proficient in English, and he did that. And while he was translating the play, he said to his friend, well, do you know, this is actually dreadful. This is a dreadful Bengali play. If I knew they wanted a Bengali play, I could have written one better than that. And of course, he was known as this very anglicised man, and everyone said, you write a play in Bengali? you can't write in Bengali, you're known for writing English. And he took that as a challenge, and he began to write this play, which was actually a drama, which in fact is also based on his life, because it's based on an episode from the Mahabharata, and you'll see the resonances in his life, because the episode in the Mahabharata is about a king who falls in love with two women, and he somehow comes to live happily with both of these two women, which resonates very much with his life. So he writes this play, which Sharmista in Bengali, and it's a huge success, and he actually gets much more recognition for that play that he's written in Bengali than he has for any of these works that he's written before in English. And this kind of starts off, I think, a creative sort of strain, I suppose, in him, and he's a great linguist, and he starts to write all these other works in Bengali. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, the only thing to add was that he actually got some really negative feedback about his English poetry.
He did.
He got some very bad feedback, and people said to him, why don't you write in your own language? And then, together with this experience of, I could do this better myself, and people saying, oh, you can't possibly write a Bengali play, made him determined to be good at writing Bangla. And his style of writing Bangla is actually very artistic and Sanskritized, very different from the other people around him who were writing in Bangla.
It is in terms of Meghnad Bodh, which I have to say I haven't read in Bengali because it is very difficult, but I have read the Clinton Seeley translation and the William Radici translation. But the farces are actually very, very easy to read. They're much more in colloquial language, they're much more accessible. And I think that the thing with Datta is that there sometimes is this way of seeing him as this person who wrote this highly Sanskritized, very literary Bengali, and everybody's heard of him, but nobody's actually read him. I kind of think of him sometimes as the John Milton. Everybody has heard of Paradise Lost, but nobody's actually read it. And people forget, I think, sometimes that he wrote these farces, which are very accessible, which are in very colloquial language. They're not available in translation. So yeah, absolutely, I agree with you. He was groundbreaking in the way he wrote verse. He was the first person to bring blank verse into the Bengali language. And he wrote this highly mythological Sanskritized verse, but he also did write these very contemporary plays, which I think people sometimes forget about.
The decision to sell all his lands and move to the UK to study law, that's a very dramatic decision. What was the catalyst for that?
Well, he was a very dramatic man, first of all. And he also actually needed to make a living. You don't earn that much money as a writer. And he actually said, I think there's a quote where he says, I would have loved to devote myself to literature, but I need to earn a living. And he thought that if he came back, that there were very few, if any, I think, Bengali barristers at the time. I think there may have been two. So he thought if he came back, he'd be this Bengali barrister, he'd make so much money. His father, don't forget, was a very rich man. And he'd been a jobbing translator, teacher, interpreter, and journalist. And he wanted to make, Michael Madhusudan Dutt was always in debt. One of the other things he's famous for is borrowing money. So he wanted to make money, and I think that was certainly one of the factors behind him going to become a barrister. But I think it was also caught up with the whole kind of growth of Indian nationalism at the time. This was the time when, for the first time, Bengalis were becoming part of the anglicised Indian National Service. One of Tagore's elder brothers, he was, I think, the first Bengali to become part of this higher Indian National Service, civil service. And I think Dutt saw himself as part of that group as well.
The legal kind of education.
Yeah, the kind of British legal system that he was going to bring back as a Bengali. So I think there were lots of reasons. It was part to do with the tenor of the times, partly to do with personality, and partly to do with practical reasons. He needed to earn money.
Write again. That's
No, he did write, but he never wrote as successfully again. He wrote another play, I think, which was about the death of Hector. I think it's a Bengali version of a Greek story. And he started writing several things, but he had a very stressful life in the latter half, the last sort of 15 years of his life. So he started writing several things and just never finished them because of the pressures of work, children, and so on.
Alcohol.
Alcohol, yes. Like so many of the Potherlook of the time, he was an alcoholic.
So how did the British take an Indian trying to become like English?
Well, again, I'm very glad you asked that, because although he was a Hindu by birth and he converted to Christianity, actually he wasn't really accepted by either of those faiths. And you see this actually very much when he died, because when he died, he wasn't buried by the Hindus, of course, because he was no longer a Hindu. And in those days, burials were generally very quick, within a few hours. But the Christian church didn't want to bury him. It took over 24 hours to get permission from, his friends went from bishop to bishop to bishop to try and get permission to get him buried, and eventually they did get permission. And he was buried in a Christian cemetery. But he wasn't really part of the Christian community any more really than he was part of the Hindu community. And actually there's a lovely quote which I'll find for you, when his friends say to him, when he's dying, one of his friends says to him, there's going to be a problem about having you buried. And he says, I care not for man-made churches, nor for anybody's help. I am going to sleep in my Lord, and he will hide me in his best resting place. Bury me wherever you like, at your door or under a tree. Let none disturb my bones. Let green turf grow over my resting place on earth. And I think that's, it's a beautiful quote, but it's also very tragic, because it shows you how he really wasn't accepted by the Christian community, and he cut himself off to a large extent from his own community.
Where was he buried then? In Calcutta or in
He was buried in Calcutta. I will find it in this book. His tomb, if Priyanka was here, she could tell me, but I'm pretty sure it's a famous graveyard in Calcutta.
St. Paul's Cathedral somewhere?
No, he was buried in Calcutta.
Yeah, St. Paul's Cathedral in Calcutta.
Oh, is there St. Paul? Sorry, I'm from Bangladesh, so I'm not very familiar with Calcutta.
Most of the English who died.
Okay, right.
Missionaries and people who served in East India.
It says nearly 1,000 people joined the procession that made its way to the cemetery in Lower Circular Road. Does that mean anything?
Probably there,
yeah. So that's where his grave is.
Just to remind us the period. When was he born?
1824 he was born, 40 years pretty much before Tagore, and he died in 1873 at the very young age really of 49.
How many years did he stay in this country?
Not long, 3 or 4 years, for as long as well, actually it's interesting because when he came to this country to study, to become a barrister, he decided, he's a very bizarre man, he was followed by his wife and his children, well, by Henrietta and the children, and he decided that it was too expensive for him to live in London to qualify as a barrister. So he was going to go to Versailles. So he actually spent a large amount of time in Paris, and he just came back to sit the terms that you have to sit for being a barrister. And his children were actually fluent in French because they spent 3 or 4 years in France. So he spent, I think, 3 or 4 years in England, but a lot of that time he actually spent in France.
So their children probably are still
2 of them died. Well, I don't know what happened to Rebecca's children actually, because I sort of lose track of them. But Henrietta's children, 2 of them died quite young. One did survive into adulthood. So one assumes he must have
Just
ancestors.
for information, one lady was going to come here. Her name is Danielle. You know Daniela? She sent an email. She said she knew one of his daughters.
Okay. Yeah.
But she couldn't make it today.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
She's very interested.
Yeah. I mean, he must have ancestors because he had 7 children altogether. So chances are that some of them had children and they had children. Yeah, that would be really interesting.
Alive today could know daughter's daughter.
Well, let me check the email. Yeah.
Sorry, what did you want to ask us?
This is 200 years ago.
Maybe daughters.
I didn't mean his daughter. I mean he must have ancestors. They must have, not ancestors, descendants. Yeah. I didn't mean his daughter.
If I was actually going to ask you, you said that he didn't quite fit into either the Hindu or the Christian community, and I know that in some parts of India, even people who converted to Christianity were not totally accepted because the converted classes were often not. Is that why, or did he just happen to have alienated everybody?
I think, to be honest, the British didn't like the fact that he had 2 English wives. I think that was a big part of the reason that, because he really wasn't, if you like, a practicing Christian. I mean, he was a man of faith. You can see that from from the quote I read you when he died, when he says he'll be buried in God's arms. But I don't think he was a sectarian man in any way. He didn't define himself particularly as a Christian or as a Hindu. He defined himself as a man of faith. But I think it's interesting actually, because when he came back as a barrister to Calcutta, he had to have basically his papers signed off by British officials, and they refused to sign them off.
Sorry, I made a complete mistake by it. You should do with, you know, the last Raja of West.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
She
She
knew his daughter.
knew who's.
You know, the present Whitechapel Raja.
Okay. So I think a lot of the dislike or the distance that the Christian community kept. I mean, the whole issue about converted Christians is another issue, but I don't think that was the reason that Dutt was disapproved of so much.
But in Calcutta, if he hadn't had two wives, you think he would have been accepted
as a Christian?
Would the church not have quibbled then? In some parts.
Yeah, I don't know enough, to be honest, about the Christian, and also there's I know there's a very old Christian community that precedes 19th century Calcutta, in not just in Calcutta but in India generally. I don't know very much about the Christian convert community, but yes, I know that there was prejudice against them. I know after the 1857 mutiny, or First War of Independence, or Sea Mutiny, or whatever you want to call it, there was a real withdrawal of British Christians from Indian Christians, so there were certainly a lot of issues going on there.
Just one more point which might be of interest to everybody, because you talked about the rice Christians, brought to memory my childhood, where I knew people who were powder milk Christians. Powdered milk was sent over by USAID, and all the poor people who wanted to convert would get powdered milk for free. So
this is what I mean. He's a very contemporary figure, you see.
Whatever helps, they don't mind changing their faith.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned earlier about the young Bengals.
The group Young Bengal,
So it's basically an organisation that kind of promoted literacy.
Young Bengal was actually, in fact, the influence of Young Bengal came from a Eurasian. He was half Portuguese and half English. He was called Henry de Rosio, and he taught at the Hindu.
Sort of radical Hindus?
Yes, they weren't. Henry de Rosio was actually thrown out of the Hindu college because of the backlash from the parents. They didn't want him, a man like that, teaching their sons. And as I say, he died tragically very young. I think he was only 22, 23 when he was young, when he died. So yes, there was a backlash from the traditional, from the fathers wanted to be anglicised, but not that anglicised. So yes, there was.
So the young Bengal group were all within the confines of that college?
It was mainly Hindu college students, not exclusively, I think, but mainly.
So when they were talking about women's rights and women's education, were these all men talking about rather than any involvement of women in the discussion?
Yeah, I mean the movement for women's emancipation, certainly in the mid to late 19th century in India, was very much driven by men.
Sure.
I don't think you can get away from that. Women, it was very much a male-driven movement at the beginning of that movement. Yeah, absolutely.
That's it. I asked about he's a sonnet writer.
He was a
sonnet.
Do you
have any idea that this, how he became very famous for that?
Yeah, he did. He as Hannah was saying, he introduced many technical innovations into the Bengali language, and one of those was the sonnet, which he took from European literature and wrote in Bengali. He actually wrote the majority of his sonnets, I think, when he was abroad. Manga Pusher, the one about the river in Joshua, those.
That's the reverse.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Those he wrote earlier in his career, but most of his sonnets he wrote while he was abroad. And that was another huge technical innovation that came actually later in his career, after the plays and the poems that he's famous for.
I'm from actually Jessel.
Oh, are you?
Oh. Familiar with
Have you been? Have you been to the? See, I've never. Oh, really?
And long time ago, when I went, that is 30 years ago, when I was very like young. I actually seen it was really poor condition of his house, old house where he was born, and now it was really making it really nice. Just people visited, a lot of people.
Yeah, it seems from the pictures I've seen on the internet, it seems.
And it is a chance, so you have to go there, and then it was really, really nice. That,
I mean, I would love to go, I have to say. I didn't realise that he was from Joshua until I started studying him, but certainly if I'm ever in Joshua, I'm certainly going to go and visit Michael Madhusudan Dutt's house.
That was not there like this, but now they're making, only the library was there, and after that they renovate all lot of things, and it was really like like a heart. It's really small, and now it's
I mean, I think Priyanka, who was just here, she's from Uttarpara, which is a town outside Calcutta, and at the end of his life he had no money, and he actually lived in a couple of rooms in the public library in Uttarpara, and there's actually some sort of memorial to him in Uttarpara as well now, I understand from her. I think I've exhausted all my knowledge now. Go on, Ahmed.
Tagore or any other Greek poets taken influence from?
Tagore speaks, he speaks. I always think that Michael Madhusudan Dutt is kind of the forgotten man of Bengali literature. Everybody talks about Tagore, but actually Michael Madhusudan Dutt was the father of modern Bengali literature, and Tagore acknowledged that. Many of the popular writers acknowledge that, but it's something that we seem to have lost ourselves, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.